Good morning. My name is Molly and Dana, and I am Penobscot. I am a Penobscot Nation tribal citizen, and I also proudly serve as our tribal ambassador. And I'm really happy to be able to share with you today some thoughts around the history of the tribes in Maine, kind of where we are now and how we walk forward together, and how that figures into social justice and economic justice, and a whole variety of things. And I would love for this to be as interactive as possible as we can be in our little Zoom world. So feel free to throw questions in the chat and interact as you want to. And yeah, I've been doing a lot of keynotes lately, so this feels nice, little change of pace to be, more of a workshop setting. So I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. And we will play. Okay. So I would like to focus this around tribal sovereignty in Maine. And just to get us kind of grounded in what I mean when I talk about the Wabanaki, I'm talking about, it comes from the word Wabanaki in our language, which means people of the dawn. So just geographically speaking, we are the first people to see the sunrise, and that's really where our name for ourselves came from. So this Wabanaki Confederacy historically includes upwards of 20 tribes, and I call them the lost tribes in my second bullet here. So at one point we had over 20 distinct tribal nations in the land now called Maine. Because of things I'll get into in a little while here, we went through a massive loss of resources and life, and we are left with the tribes now in the Confederacy: the Maliseet, the Micmac, the Passamaquoddy, the Penobscot, and the Wabanaki. So my tribe is the Penobscot Nation, and we are kind of centrally located in Maine. We're near Bangor. And the Aroostook County has the two tribes, the Holton Band of Maliseet and the Aroostook Band of Micmac. The Passamaquoddy is the largest of the tribal nations, and they have two reservation communities over in Washington County. And then the Wabanaki people are those people that this is their ancestral homeland, and their official kind of recognized reservation is now at Odanak in Canada, but this is their homeland, and a lot of them still reside here in Wabanaki territory. So this concept of homeland, I think, is really important when talking about the tribes in Maine and everywhere in the United States and Canada. And some of our most sacred things that we identify with in our culture all have to do with the land. You've probably seen a lot of place names or other names around the state that are in Indigenous language. And usually those names are describing the landscape, or Katahdin, for example, means great mountain. So it's kind of silly to us when people call it Mount Katahdin because it's kind of redundant. So a lot of our struggles and triumphs and issues have to do around land. So that's going to be an important theme for this. And this thought of our ancestral territory, which is the entire state and beyond, versus our current tribal land holdings, which are very small. And we'll get into some of the reasons for that. But a lot of tribal people don't really see our territory as limited to our reservations or our trust lands. They really feel this connection to the entire state. And thinking about that connection to land, it's something that we are in relationship to, and not something that we own or want to conquer, or we just have a very different sense of how we relate to land, and it's more of a stewardship than ownership. This is a picture of my home. I walk my dog very early in the morning, so I get a lot of awesome sunrise shots. So this is the Penobscot River, Penobscot territory. Our word Banawaskeg means where the white rocks spread out. So our word for ourselves is in direct relation to how we describe our home. So I'll get right into the not so fun stuff, and I promise you we'll get to a happier place together. The pandemic is kind of a triggering event for tribal nations. This disease as warfare was the first thing that kind of started this massive genocide attempt on our people. The settlers, with the pilgrims and Thanksgiving, and before that, the explorers, they brought over a lot of diseases that Indigenous people didn't have immunity to, most notably smallpox. And, gifts were sometimes exchanged from the settlers to the tribal people. And these blankets that were often given as gifts would have smallpox on them. So a lot of Indigenous people died. When we think of kind of the sheer loss of life, I think it's easy to think in terms of like warfare, and there certainly was plenty of that, like bloody conquest, but so much of this dying happened through disease. And we don't think that the settlers had this concept of germ warfare, but there is evidence to point to the fact that they saw the Indigenous people dying off as a sign that God had chosen the settlers to kind of take over this country. And they saw this as, it's the beginning of that manifest destiny. We are meant to be here, so we're going to take over type thing. And I just put in some kind of bullet points here, and none of them are very happy, like I said, but thinking about how we talk about history and what we want to honor, I think it's timely that we just had Maine's third Indigenous Peoples Day, and we switched over from Columbus Day. And that's really important for Indigenous people, because for a long time in this state, and now, in many other places, there is this holiday that basically glorifies a lot of the start of this genocidal thinking. In Columbus's writing, you can see that he thought the tribal people were less than human, as only good as slaves, and that, he admired them, but was also very, very cruel to them. So the fact that Columbus Day has been celebrated for all these years has sent a message to Indigenous people that our genocide and our dehumanity is something that America wants to celebrate. So it can feel symbolic and just like a name, but it really does have far-reaching implications when you feel as a people, your very existence isn't something that people around you want, and that they want to celebrate that you were almost killed off. It's also, making this switch, it fixes a lot of the historical narrative, because you can't discover something that is already here. And also, Columbus never came into this part of America, which is, a lot of people credit him for discovering our country, but he actually never came here up this far. So I want to talk a little bit about Thanksgiving, since we are rapidly approaching that holiday as well. And I think that this story that we're often told as little kids of there was pilgrims and there was Indians, and the Indians helped out the pilgrims and brought them food, and they had this great meal and everybody became best friends. That feels good. It feels comfortable. It feels like, a very sweet tale of friendship and overcoming differences and helping one another. And the real story was a little bit like that. There were Native people. They did bring a meal to the pilgrims who were having a hard time, but pretty much immediately after that, they entered into this series of wars that were brutal and barbaric, and there definitely wasn't an allyship between these settlers and the tribes. The settlers waged a lot of war against the tribes. So it's nice that we celebrate Thanksgiving and we're thankful for our families, but I think it's important to think about the true story there. And it's definitely a topic for a much longer time than we have today. But I do encourage you to do a little bit of learning about the real Thanksgiving and about those Native people in Massachusetts and around Plymouth Rock, the Pequot and the Pequot, and those people down there. And I really do think it's really important to learn those true histories, just like we did around Columbus. So starting after this, we move into this era where the Native people were seen as traitors to the crown, traitors to the government of the colonies, and really kind of rebels that wouldn't just get out of the way and allow for the conquest of our homeland. The government issued proclamations to the settlers to go out and find and hunt Indigenous people and turn in their scalps as proof of their being killed. And this was sanctioned by the government. It was, something that a lot of settlers took part in. And it really, reminds me of the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust in World War II. You had people that, you wouldn't see as evil, or you wouldn't characterize them as having this streak where they want to be murderers, but they go along with what is happening because they're desperate, or they're, following orders. And I think a lot of that happened right here on our shores. These proclamations, and I have an example of one in a further slide, they set prices on the heads of different of the men, women, and children from the tribal nations. And a male Penobscot scalp, you would get 50 pounds for that. So in our modern currency, that's like $11,000. So you have these settlers that are trying to survive these hard winters, and being able to possibly kill a family of Indigenous people, that's a huge payday. And unfortunately, this led to a lot of these scalpings and these massacres, and it's a really dark time in our American history. This also really weakened tribal nations, and we saw this massive theft of land after this. We really saw, this is when we see Indigenous people pushed into reservations, and as America forms, the kind of subjugation of the Indigenous people continues very, very rapidly. So we fast forward a little bit more. I think a lot of times when we think about these genocidal acts, we think about a long, long time ago, and the things I've talked about, the smallpox and the warfare. We, coming into this next era, the country's formed, the reservations are formed, the tribal people are very diminished, but very much still alive, and still practicing our culture, and still rebelling against the government, and still not thoroughly happy with what's gone on. So the next line of attack was to try to assimilate Indigenous people into the mainstream settler culture. And we saw a pretty disturbing way of doing this was these boarding schools run by the federal government and the churches. And these were programs where the people would come and take children from their families and tribal nations, children as young as 3, and they would go miles and miles from their homes to these residential and boarding schools. They were not allowed to speak their language. They would get their hair cut. They would be put in uniforms. And they would often face very horrific abuse from the nuns and priests and teachers. And recently, over the past year, they have found a lot of mass unmarked graves at these schools. And Indigenous people, we've always known this story. There's a school in Pennsylvania, the Carlisle Indian School, and a lot of Penobscot people actually went to that school, not much, older than my parents and grandparents. So it's kind of sad to us that the rest of the world kind of had to wake up to this when they saw these graves, and when they learned about the bodies of these babies, really, because it's something that we've always carried with us and known about. But kind of larger than that sadness is a real hope, I think, that people can start to see the truth and that we can really move forward in a good way. Another facet of this assimilation was the foster care system. And I would urge you to watch the movie Dawnland that gives a great look at a truth and reconciliation effort that happened right in Maine around the foster care system and the Indigenous people taken as children, often for no reason really, and put into these foster homes in Maine. And the same logic applies. The logic of these schools was kill the Indian to save the man. And a lot of these foster homes thought the same thing, that Indigenous people had to fit into society and couldn't do that while we were, holding on to our identity and our culture. And there was also a lot of abuse and trauma. So these events echo through the generations. And the pandemic has been a real trigger for a lot of this, because a lot of our, that wound that we carry started with disease. And I think that there's been a real fear and a real caution in our communities, and we've taken the pandemic very seriously. And any kind of large scale event will affect us at a disproportionate rate because there's not that many of us. So there's also, we'll talk a little bit about, I won't get into it too much, but there's a mental health component of how this has all played out in a public way. I think a lot of the imagery and the representation of Indigenous people in media and in movies and stories is stereotypical, and it's not things written by us. It's somebody else telling our story, and often telling it the wrong way. And this goes for sports teams, mascots, and other things. I will say that some of the best representation I've ever seen of our people is the new show Reservation Dogs. It's just so good. It's Indigenous actors and writers and producers and creators. They film it on a reservation, and my kids are 12 and 14, and we watch it together. And I just keep telling them, you are so lucky. You are seeing an accurate representation of yourself and your family and your values. So that makes me feel very hopeful that we're able to get our stories out there and appreciated by such a large audience. And I think it does a lot of that healing already. So how do we heal our people, and how do we operate in spaces and relationships in our current realities? And I think that's what I want to focus on today, is that, we are coming from a dark place sometimes, and we have to honor our ancestors, and we have to think about everything that's happened to us, but we're also operating today. I live in a reservation community. I'm raising my children here, and I'm working on policy to try to bring about equity and fairness that has to do with a lot of these historical factors, but also, I want to help my people today. And then how do we do that with our friends and allies and neighbors, and how do we work towards that together? So this is an example of some of the stereotypical imagery I've talked about. This is the Cleveland Indian Chief Wahoo logo. And so growing up myself, this was a big stereotypical Indian representation of me, of my people. And obviously I look nothing like that. It really plays up, the red skin, the large nose, you got the stereotypical feather, it looks kind of goofy. And I think a lot of times people say, well, these mascots should honor you. And I just don't find anything in this that I can feel honored about. And even when the mascots look pretty, or they're like brave warriors or whatever, that's also harmful. And I'll get into that a little bit too. But thankfully, noting more progress, the Cleveland Indians has made a change to the Cleveland Guardians, and they'll be having a new mascot next year. This is the American Psychological Association recommendation from 2005 that recommends that all schools do away with these Indian mascots because of a lot of the reasons I've talked about. And I feel that this fits into the larger picture, because how can we be respected as modern day contributors to this society when we're not seen as human in these mascots? I can't think of any other race that is just depicted this way and just disrespected time and time again. And having our culture kind of stolen and mocked and misused. You know, that's our religion, those feathers and that war paint. So I'm really happy that we have our feelings about the mascot. We know how it makes us feel, and that feels harmful and hurtful, but we also have evidence and research and facts to back that up. This is the Scout Proclamation that I spoke about. So this is from 1755, and you can't read it that well, but this is the document that called for specific prices for Penobscot scalps, and they would basically trade these at trading posts next to like animal hides and skins. So it's a very dark history, and I don't think it's anything that people are learning about in history books or in schools. I want to touch briefly on missing and murdered Indigenous women and how that fits into our overall, you know, health and well-being and justice as a people. So on Indigenous Peoples Day last week, a week ago, yesterday, at nighttime, trying to find the Red Sox game on TV, Pocahontas was on the Disney Channel. And I thought a lot about, you know, even though this looks pretty, she's beautiful, she talks with animals, she has a huge heart, she saves John Smith, they have this great love story. It feels good to watch, you know, just like that story of Thanksgiving. It's not at all what actually happened. The real Pocahontas was 14 years old when she met the settlers. She was kidnapped, taken to Europe, and died of disease at a very young age, away from her home and people. So I feel like even though they did a very pretty job with it, they had an Indigenous woman voice her, telling a false story is still harmful because it doesn't give life to the real woman. And it fits into this epidemic that we have right now of missing and murdered Indigenous women, where, you know, 1 in 3 of us will be the victim of a crime or will be murdered. And those cases, because of jurisdictional issues between tribal, state, and federal agencies, are often not looked into, not investigated, and we rarely ever get justice. So, you know, thinking of the case last month with Gabby Petito, you know, we all know her name, we all know what she looks like and who she is. She had a tragic death at the hands of her boyfriend, and that's a tragedy. Something I noticed the second she went missing, it was all hands on deck. Her face was all over the news. You know, the federal, local, state agencies all came together to try to find her. And that's how it should be when any, you know, precious life is missing and the victim of something horrific. So I feel like that really shined a light on the disparity between, you know, why do we care so much about one woman, but we don't know the names and faces of the thousands of Indigenous women that have gone missing and murdered in the past, you know, few years. I like to share this graphic after we talk about the boarding schools, because I feel like it brings a lot of hope. So the Orange Shirt Project and the Orange Shirt Day in Canada was developed because a young residential school girl was actually excited about going to one of these schools, and her grandmother had given her an orange shirt to wear. They took the orange shirt from her. She never got to wear it. She went through the school, suffered quite a bit of trauma, but she's alive and she tells her story. So we wear orange to honor these babies. And I love this graphic because it really shows that hope for new life, even after everything our people have been through. So now we come to Maine. And Maine has its own difficulties with tribal state relations, and it really figures into the journey of the tribes in Maine, and we have to know all this history before we can think about economic justice, social justice, and equity in a real way. So I've talked about where the tribes are in Maine geographically and how this is our homeland and kind of who all the tribes are. In the late 1970s, it was discovered by the Passamaquoddy tribe that the treaties that oversaw the taking of about 2/3 of the state when Maine separated from Massachusetts were actually not legal because they weren't ratified by the federal government as per the Federal Non-Intercourse Act. So the Passamaquoddy and then the Penobscot and later the Maliseet brought suit against the state of Maine to deal with these land claims. And the result was, these land claims were dealt with and settled. And this is the 1980 Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act. And in Maine, there was another law called the Implementing Act that kind of, implemented this all here. And I was born in 1984, so I was not around, but I have lived my whole life under this act and kind of have witnessed a lot of the confusion and difficulty that we've had from it. So essentially, Jimmy Carter was the president, and he was very likely to sign an agreement should an agreement be reached. Ronald Reagan was coming into office after him and was very clear that he would not sign an agreement. So there was this real pressure to try to reach an agreement around these claims to land. In Maine, it was a time of a lot of chaos. You had people thinking that the tribes are going to come take back all of the land. You had people on their porches with shotguns guarding their property. And it was a very hectic time and a lot of distrust and tension. And unfortunately, the document hasn't solved a lot of that distrust and tension, but we'll get into that. So the document really needed to deal with land and money, and it did that. The state of Maine put no funds into the settlement. It was all from the federal government, and the tribes received money to buy back land from the federal government and have the government hold that land in trust for the tribal nations. So the act went a step further, and there was a real concern from the state negotiators that the tribes would act like nations within a nation, and that we would be kind of too sovereign, and that our power would be seen as superseding the state. So they put language in there that essentially relegated the tribal nations to municipalities. There's also language in there that blocks the tribes in Maine from having access to any federal legislation written to benefit federally recognized tribes. So in these past 41 years, there have been about 150 laws that have passed that the tribes in Maine haven't had access to. So this wasn't a very good deal. The tribes did agree to it, and I have people in my family that agreed with it and said, we didn't think we would ever get another deal. Our communities were in poverty. And we were told that we could come back and revisit this and make amendments if it wasn't working. I have other members of my family that said, nope, I saw the writing on the wall. I knew this would do away with our sovereignty and that we would just be treated like any other town. So the consequences of this have been tension, confusion, mistrust, litigation. The tribes maintain that we never ceded our sovereignty. The state has interpreted things in a way that essentially says the tribes only have the rights of municipalities. And it's been, I don't think it's been great for either side over the years as far as the litigation aspect. I do think it has favored the state in regards to they've really been able to keep their jurisdictional control, and they have prevented a lot of tribal sovereignty from being able to be used. So there have been a lot of efforts to amend this. The Suffolk University report was a report that was commissioned by the Maine Indian Tribal State Commission, and they looked at, all the areas of this act, and they actually, highlighted how Maine has really benefited from this and how it has really oppressed and stifled the tribes. Fast forward to 2019. We had leadership in Augusta in the legislature that was very invested in trying to make some meaningful change. There was a lot of bills being put in by representatives that had to do with this act, because I think a lot of people realize that the root of a lot of this tension is this settlement act. So there were some bills that looked to just kind of amend it piece by piece. There was at least one bill that I saw that would repeal the whole thing, which is tricky. But at the end of the day, the legislative leadership, it was then Speaker Sarah Gideon and President Troy Jackson of the Senate, they came together and called for a task force. And the task force consisted of the tribal chiefs or their designees, bipartisan lawmakers, and non-voting members of the Attorney General, or non-voting representatives of the Attorney General's office, the Governor's office, and the Maine Indian Tribal State Commission. So this group was chaired by the then chairs of the Judiciary Committee, which was former Senator Mike Carpenter and former Representative Donna Bailey. She's now a senator. And they met 7 times, I believe, and they basically studied federal Indian law. They studied the history of the Settlement Act. They learned about, why the tribes in Maine should probably still be able to act like federally recognized tribes, even though we had this Land Claim Settlement Act. And they learned about a lot of the ways it hasn't worked so well for the past 40 years. The result was a set of 22 recommendations that covers things like taxation, criminal and civil jurisdiction, land and natural resources, fish and game, land acquisition. There was a provision about the Federal Violence Against Women Act that we were able to pass through state statute to get that jurisdiction to the tribes in Maine. That was one of the federal acts that didn't apply to the tribes because of the Settlement Act. And there's also language about applying those federal acts to the tribes in Maine. So this very large set of recommendations was put into a bill, and in the previous session, it was called LD 2094. The pandemic halted all of that work, and we have restarted it, and now it is LD 1626. It is sponsored by Assistant Majority Leader Rachel Talbot Ross. It is a great bill. It's an omnibus, so there's many pieces to it, but it is essentially those recommendations that were brought forth by the task force. One bill that we ran separately that I'll get into a little bit later was strictly about tribal gaming, and that was LD 554. And I'll tell that story in a few slides. So this bill, the tribes really came around this effort to amend the Settlement Act because it really has affected all of our communities. And we formed a group called the Wabanaki Alliance, which is a nonprofit. We are really busy advocating for this bill, and I'm really excited to see what we're able to pass and what the future looks like, because I have this great vision of living in Maine as a tribal person when we're done with all this fighting with the state. And I really think that can only happen if we amend the Settlement Act and have some of that inherent tribal sovereignty recognized and restored. And I'm hopeful that we can work on that together with the state, and that we can reach some agreements on some key pieces of that act that have been such an issue for the tribes. So this was the signing of the 1980 Maine Indian Land Claim Settlement Act. And it is, it has been a bad deal, but I don't want to take anything away from the people that worked really hard on this. And a lot of people saw this as a really historic moment where a state could reach this kind of agreement over land claims with tribal nations. So you have President Jimmy Carter signing with an eagle feather pen. You have members of the state delegation and the tribal delegation. And, I think a lot of these people at the time couldn't have foreseen a lot of the stress and frustration that this law would cause. And I think there was a lot of hope. And I would like to, as we are in these current negotiations, I would love to just remind people that there can be hope if we're all kind of on the same page and unified, that we want all people in Maine to prosper and do well, including the tribes. So equity and justice as in a tribal sovereignty context. And I want to talk about the word sovereign. I noticed a news story about, what do they call themselves? The Moors. There are these, group of people, they call themselves sovereign beings. They think that they can, take over people's houses, and they were arrested coming into Maine and carrying firearms. And they think they don't have to follow laws. That's not what we mean when we say sovereign. To me, tribal sovereignty is about protecting what is most sacred about our communities. And that's one another, the people, it's natural resources, it's Mother Earth, it's our culture, our identity, our customs. And we are best able to protect those things when we are self-determined and self-governed. And that's really what we mean by sovereign nations. So the Settlement Act has been a barrier to fairness because it really, it's like you can't have it both ways. You can't be federally recognized sovereign nations while living like a state of Maine municipality. And since we still have that status as tribes, we should be able to have, access to resources from the federal government through those beneficial acts. We should be able to have, be able to prosecute anybody committing a crime on tribal lands. We should be able to set our own policies and laws and procedures around those tribal lands and fishing game. So, and I think something to think about is that the tribes are very capable of doing these things. We've had very sophisticated environmental departments in all of our tribal nations. We have food sovereignty programs, we have social service programs, we have health centers. There has to be, at some point, we have to move away from this idea that the state needs to oversee what we're doing all the time. And we have to get away from this kind of paternalistic mindset. And so the areas of, okay, I went over those a little bit, talked about the Violence Against Women Act. So this was one of the acts that was really oppressing tribal nations, not being able to have access to it. So I talked a little bit about the missing and murdered Indigenous women. A lot of the chaos and struggle around these cases is this jurisdictional issue. So in Maine, 2 tribes have tribal courts, Penobscot and Passamaquoddy, and we weren't able to have Violence Against Women Act jurisdiction in our communities when the victim was a Native woman and or a Native person, and the abuser was not a tribal member. We would have to send these cases to different courts throughout the state. They often didn't quite know what to do with them. So we weren't getting any justice for victims because of these jurisdictional issues. We were re-traumatizing victims, sending them to different places. And I'm really happy that in the 129th legislature, we had a bill that was able to extend VAWA at least 2 tribes in Maine through state statute. We have a current bill that would extend the Tribal Law and Order Act to the tribes in the same way, and that's also going to be moving through the process with 1626. And the Tribal Law and Order Act would look at criminal cases as well as civil. So if we just had access to federal laws, we wouldn't have to do it piecemeal like this, if we could just amend the Settlement Act to have access to any of these laws. So gaming, I promised I would tell this story. I remember back in 2003, my dad, Barry Dana, was chief of the tribe, and we had a proposal on the Maine referendum that in that election year to have a tribally owned casino. It was a large effort. It would be based in Sanford, I believe. And because of the Settlement Act, we don't have access to Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. So we have to put these initiatives in front of the voters of Maine. We can't just exercise Class 3 gaming as tribes, like every other tribe in the country. So that year, 2003, our question was number 3. I remember being out on a highway overpass holding up a yes on 3 sign, working for my dad, before the vote. And there was another question on the ballot that would expand gaming in Bangor at their raceway, and that was question 2. Our question lost miserably. Maine soundly defeated our tribal casino, and this has happened a few times throughout history. Maine soundly approved the Bangor gaming. A few years later, they approved a casino in Oxford. So there's been a message sent to tribes that Maine is okay with gaming as long as the tribes aren't doing it or benefiting from it. And that's been a hard pill to swallow for sure, especially when you're talking about economic justice and having, all of those means that should be available to our people for economic development. As far as gaming being a moral or a philosophical issue, I have to say that I don't like it. I don't enjoy casinos. It's not my cup of tea, but I do really believe in the right of tribes to make the decision for ourselves. And that's really, what these efforts are about. So in the last session, we had LD 554 that was sponsored by Representative Ben Collins from Portland. And this was essentially a very good bill that we supported wholeheartedly. And it was an authorization of tribal gaming, but through the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act lens. So IGRA, as it's called at the federal level, is actually, it's not like a carte blanche authorization of tribal gaming. It's actually a regulatory act that sets up a process for negotiating state compacts around gaming with tribes. So the bill was very much based in that approach. It didn't lay out a specific project or which tribe was going to do it and where. It just kind of said tribes in Maine should have access to the process of this federal act that should apply to tribes. So we got this bill through committee, through the House, through the Senate, and a bipartisan support. It was vetoed by Governor Mills. And she did write a very long, thoughtful veto letter about this bill. And it basically laid out her fear of unintended consequences if Maine didn't have a lot of control over tribal gaming efforts. We almost got a veto override in the House. I think we were 3 or 4 votes short. So that may be writing on the wall for our next big bill. It may not be, but we are very aware of where the support lies and how to shape our strategy around that. LD 1626 was carried over from last year. It will be in front of the Judiciary Committee in January, and we will start all the good times then with that bill. I want to touch a little bit on the climate crisis and how this affects tribal nations. I just want to kind of magnify the concerns of my people here today. So for us, this idea of land stewardship really isn't a separate issue. It's woven into everything we do. So thinking about all of our health outcomes, our economy, our day-to-day lives of our people, Mother Earth has to be present in all of our decisions and all of our deliberations and thought process. It's definitely a fact that frontline communities are hit the hardest by the climate crisis. And I have the honor of being a co-chair of the Equity Subcommittee of the Maine Climate Council, and I'm a member of the Maine Climate Council. So we've really gotten to talk a lot about how do we bring everybody along as we talk about climate change, as we talk about caring for the land. We talked about people should be buying more electric vehicles. How about people that have never been to a car dealership to buy a car? How about people that can't drive? So really thinking about the most marginalized and vulnerable people. And if we're not bringing them along and helping them work through climate change, we're really not doing our job. I think clean water rights have been such a huge part of the tribal struggles in Maine. I'll just jump down a little bit here. So I live on Indian Island. I am between Nine Dragons Paper Mill in Old Town and the Juniper Ridge landfill in Old Town. So our river is our barrier between us and Old Town, and that river has suffered so much because of the discharge from industry and other pollutants. We have very high rates of cancer in our community, and we've never been able to establish a direct link between kind of the environmental concerns, but you can't deny that dioxin and mercury and these other chemicals, you know, in our homeland, you know, that has to have an effect on the health of our people. When I was growing up, I wasn't allowed to swim in the river. There was 3 paper mills operating above us, and right now those are all dormant. And I remember the water having an odor. There would be like thick white foam on the top. You would see a lot of dead fish floating around. There wasn't a lot of life in the river. And probably one of the better collaborations between the state and the tribes was the Penobscot River restoration, kind of a large scale look at the health of the river, removal of some dams, return of some fish. And the Penobscot Nation has a very great water quality testing program and has been able to keep a very close eye on the levels of these chemicals. And it has been a great asset to our community. So throughout the closing of some of that industry and some of those other efforts, the water is much cleaner today. My kids can swim in the river. And, my daughter says she feels very lucky that she's able to feel so connected to her home and be in that water. And she, feels badly that when I was her age, I couldn't feel that closeness. And I never really thought about it that way, but that feels like some progress for sure. So sustenance fishing, we're involved in this very large lawsuit right now, the Penobscot Nation with the state of Maine. The federal government is also on the side of the Penobscot Nation. And it goes back a long way. It's about water quality standards. It's about kind of who has control over this water. The Penobscot Nation maintained that the river is part of our homeland, and the state of Maine, tries to have a lot of control over that and says that the river's for everyone, not just the Penobscot Nation. So thinking about sustenance fishing, everybody agrees that the Settlement Act lays out the right for the Penobscot people to engage in sustenance fishing. Right now, a non-pregnant person over the age of 10 can only eat 4 ounces of fish out of the river per day. So that's not anywhere near a sustenance level. So the Penobscot Nation maintains if we have the right to eat these fish, we should have the right to decide if they're healthy and if there's fish there to eat and what their environment is like. And we just maintain that the Penobscot River is part of our ancestral territory. There's also right now in Pleasant Point, over in Sabayak, the Passamaquoddy community, they have contaminated drinking water, and they have for some time. And this has to do with problems with the surrounding towns and not being able to get clean well water. And I believe that they are working towards resolutions on this. But right now, in 2021, we have a tribal community that can't drink their drinking water. And that, screams inequity to me. So, Chiwaliwini, thank you very much. I put in some resources here for more information, and I'll go through each of them. The Wabanaki Alliance, like I talked about, is our 501c3. We are very focused on that legislation right now. I serve as the president of the board. And, like I said, I would love to see if we are able to pass any of this large bill, what that'll look like. But for right now, our focus is strategizing around that legislation and amending the Settlement Act. We also have Wabanaki Public Health and Wellness, and they just do a really fabulous job of addressing public health for tribal communities in Maine. They are serving all of the communities. They've been absolutely invaluable during the pandemic. They bring in water to Pleasant Point and help them out there. They have a traveling food pantry with traditional foods in it. They have a new kind of residential treatment place in Millinocket that I believe they're doing the ribbon cutting on today. So I really can't say enough about their work, and they do it all with a very holistic, positive, inclusive attitude about their work. There's also the Permanent Commission on the Status of Racial, Indigenous, and Tribal Populations, and I get to co-chair that with Representative Rachel Talbot Ross. And this is an entity created through legislation, and like the name says, it's permanent, so it can't be, undone or done away, unless they go through law again to remove it. And we've been operating for a couple years now, and there's, tribal representatives on this body. There's representatives from other marginalized communities, African American, immigrant, and together we get to really address a lot of the holes in Maine when it comes to equity and a lot of the disparities. And we're able to hold public hearings. We advise 3 branches of government. We are able to put in legislation. And something we've done in the past is analyze legislation from a racial equity lens. So I really believe that this is kind of the future for Maine when it comes to these equity issues. If you want to learn more about tribal sovereignty and the Settlement Act and some of these big concepts, my aunt, Donna Loring, who was a former representative to the legislature, former advisor to Governor Mills, she has a radio show called Wabanaki Windows on WERU, and she really does a great job. She brings in different experts and tribal leaders. I think I have like a punch card. I've been on there 5 times, so get my 6th one free or something. And she just, gives a very holistic Indigenous viewpoint on a lot of these issues, and she does it in a very frank and upfront way. There's also Sunlight Media Collective. That's an independent journalism organization. They're on social media. They're often going live from things, and they're probably covering some things that you may not hear about in the news when it comes to tribal issues. They cover some of these land back initiatives where different land trusts or private owners want to re-gift some parcels of land back to tribes in Maine, and they cover those and do a great job. I talked about the movie Dawnland. They actually have a follow-up short film called Bounty. And Bounty is, I think it's only like 8 minutes long, and it's 3 Penobscot families. Me and my children are in there. And we sit in the Massachusetts Old State House where that proclamation that I shared was written, and we read it and discuss it with our kids, that Scout Proclamation. And we put the movie together and then watched it and thought, well, this seems a little harsh. We probably need things to go with this to put it in context and to support people through this. So the Upstander Academy, which is the organization kind of in the background of these films, Dawnland and Bounty, created this huge curriculum unit to go with the movie Bounty about the Scout Proclamations, about some of the history that I've talked about today. And they do a lot of like teacher training. So I think that they're doing a really heavy lift for tribal people by teaching a lot of this hard history. There's also the Maine Indian Tribal State Commission, MITSIC website. This is a group that the Settlement Act actually set up the parameters for. Its tribal members, its other officials appointed by the state, and they're supposed to be kind of a conflict resolution body between the tribes and the state. And their work has fluctuated over the years. Some administrations have not supported them or appointed those state positions. They are a full commission right now, so they are definitely a player in tribal state relations right now. There's also task force materials that I spoke about. The task force, the staff for the task force did a really great job, the legislative staff, of getting together a lot of those old documents, the settlement acts and implementing acts. And if you're into reading legal things in your spare time, there's some really great resources from the task force. And then some podcasts that I like to recommend. Crooked Media put together this, I skipped one. I'll start with Stolen. So Stolen is about a case of an Indigenous woman who went missing in Montana. And it really goes through her family's first, trying to get a hold of the authorities, why they didn't go look for her right away, kind of her life story. She was poor. She was a very young mother. Her name is Jermaine Charlo. There was red flags about her partner. He had arrests, for domestic violence, yet he, didn't get arrested. So it really goes through a lot of the holes in the system and, in this horrible epidemic that we're facing. There's also Crooked Media put out a podcast called This Land. And the journalist that hosts it, his name is Rebecca Nagel. She's a Cherokee citizen. And her first season, she talks all about the McGirt Supreme Court case in Oklahoma, which has to do with, it was a murder trial, but they were trying to figure out jurisdiction and whether or not the treaties held up and whether or not a lot of the state of Oklahoma was actually reservation land. And the tribes actually did win that court case. So that first season goes through that. The second season goes over the Indian Child Welfare Act and some of these cases. I spoke a little bit about the foster care system and some of those, tragedies that can result. And so this gives a modern view of ICWA today. The Indian Child Welfare Act was developed in 1978 kind of as an answer to this problem we were seeing in the foster care system. And the idea is that Native children should be placed with Native families to keep that cultural identity intact. So there were some families who had adopted or fostered Native children, and they didn't want to give the children back to the Native family members. And so things snowballed. There's more Supreme Court cases that we're waiting for. And, we're kind of all waiting to see the future of the Indian Child Welfare Act and what the Supreme Court does with it. Oops, I stopped screen sharing, but there is another podcast called Sovereign that deals with the settlement acts in Maine, and that is the SALT Academy that did that. And I'm trying to get this back here. Here we go. Okay. So I think we do have a little bit of time for some questions. So, oh, I see the chat has some. All right. What are some effective ways that non-tribal voters in Maine can address Governor Mills' concerns about LD 1626 to overcome her opposition, especially considering the upcoming election and the risk of another LePage? So this is where I'm at too. Politics aside, I believe that the leadership under the pandemic has been good. And I worry that another LePage administration might be dangerous when it comes to the pandemic and you know, kind of those common sense measures. So I also, you know, when I speak about Governor Mills, I'm mindful of that. But it is troubling that she is resisting tribal sovereignty so much. And that Penobscot River case that I talked about, she litigated that against us when she was Attorney General, and you know, said some statements that made us think that she might not really grasp what tribal sovereignty is all about. She's also done some good things. She signed the VAWA bill, she signed the Mascot bill, Indigenous Peoples Day bill, she appointed her state representatives to MITSIC. But I feel like if we don't have some real good changes on that Settlement Act and some real meaningful change and having sovereignty restored, then a lot of that's going to feel empty, and it'll feel like another broken promise. So I think the best way to talk to Governor Mills is, you know, we have the Wabanaki Alliance website, has a wonderful frequently asked questions page that deals with a lot of these fears that people have about tribal sovereignty. It has a toolkit for talking to your lawmakers and the governor, and that's just wabadakialliance.com, and you can find our toolkits and stuff. And I think at the end of the day, this doesn't have to be about Indigenous rights being special rights or taking anything away from anybody else. I really think it can be lifting all of Maine up together. So stressing that the tribes are capable of having these jurisdictional powers, and it won't kind of threaten or undermine Maine government. I think that's an important point to make with the governor. And I think just, you know, really stressing that Mainers want to be good neighbors and at least, you know, give the tribes a chance, hear us out, and keep open that communication and that negotiation. How can we non-tribal members help with support the sovereign status of Maine tribes? So yeah, I think a great start is with that Wabanaki Alliance page toolkit. That'll give you a lot of this great history and steps forward. I think as the Judiciary Committee takes the bill back up in January, you can come and testify, you can call your lawmakers, you can call the governor, write letters to the editor. I'm very happy that we have formed such a robust public response and that so many people care about tribal sovereignty. Where can we view the movie Bounty? So Bounty, we've had one premiere for tribal members last week, and I believe November 10th, there will be another virtual premiere. But Upstander Academy on Facebook has all the details about that. Yeah, and it'll be kind of, you'll be able to see it very soon. I'll try to get more details on that. The Big Indian in Freeport. I've been getting a lot of questions about this. So the Big Indian in Freeport is a very large statue of an Indian man in a headdress. And it's interesting to me, I take it back to, I did a lot of work around the removal of Indian mascots, and kind of the last holdout was Skowhegan, Maine, and they had an Indian mascot. They also have a large statue of an Indian. And as we kind of went through that back and forth with them and a lot of that painful discourse with them, they would call this statue their Indian, and they'd say, oh, we're going to meet at the Indian and you can't take our Indian. And they were almost giving the statue like more human qualities than us, you know, the Indigenous people coming to them, asking them to stop their racism. So, you know, on its face, it seems like art, you know, it's a sculpture. But when you get to these layers of psychology and what you're identifying with and what you can own, I did see a troubling trend with people, you know, giving human qualities to these Indian statues. You know, we call it the Big Indian, and that would make me think of a person, but it's not, it's a statue. So I saw an interview last week or 2 weeks ago in the paper with John Bear Mitchell, who's a Penobscot man, and he was saying they should take it down. It's stereotypical. It doesn't promote an authentic view of who we are, and we're still here. It kind of, these stereotypical representations put us like in a box in history. So, I certainly don't look like that statue. So does that make me any less Indian? And I agree with everything John said. And I think that it started a really good discussion about, what do you do when Indigenous people are saying, hey, that Indian doesn't represent us, why is it there? Can we talk about it? The urgency of taking that down, whether fighting to remove it, might detract from 1626. So I think we get these feelings a lot. I've heard, the Mascot Bill, Indigenous Peoples Day bill, that's just fluff. The governor just did that to pat you on the head and make you go away. She doesn't care about tribal sovereignty. And I can see the reasoning for that. But I also argue that those things are very important and that it's all connected. When you're not seen as people, you're not treated like people. So I think that, how could we be coming to the table to talk when we still have schools in Maine that are jumping around and playing Indian and disrespecting our people? So I don't think it has to be an either or. I think it can be, we can work on these things at once. We can multitask. I think those bills are great things. And I think it sets the stage to talk about enhanced equity in other areas, the largest one being tribal sovereignty in that Settlement Act. This Land is a Great podcast. Yeah. I've heard of an organization in Washington State called Real Went Duwamish, which asks non-tribal people in Seattle to pay monthly rent to the tribe as a way of recognizing the land they live on was taken without compensation. I can't say that word today. I'm tired. Do you have any thoughts on this kind of model? Compensation, there we go. So thinking about reparations and land back and what that looks like. I think that to successfully do this, you have to have a very specific policy or historical thing you can point to, or it will get messy. I am in favor of it. I think that it's a great idea that our people have certainly suffered because of this theft of land and resources. I think that what a lot of people don't understand is the federal funding that our communities receive. Those are based on sort of a reparation model. So those are treaties because the federal government took all of our land and enforced us under reservations. So they certainly owe us those services. We have rights that we are entitled to as tribes to healthcare and to different, federal programs. And these, they're called 538 contracts. That's the funding we get to run our governments. And those are not handouts. It's not welfare. It's based on those treaties that were negotiated, around the reservation formations and all that. However, I'm hesitant to call it a true reparation because those treaties and those agreements are never adhered to. Our programs are never fully funded. I talked about the show Reservation Dogs, and they have a great episode where they're in the tribal health clinic and it's kind of a mess. It's like, the waiting room's full, the staff is rude, the doctor is like the dentist and the eye doctor, and he's rushing from room to room. And it's just very like stressful. And that can be what our health services feel like. However, in some tribes that have, successfully, established their sovereignty through the years, and they've been able to really get their full amount from the federal government, they have some of the most beautiful, well-run health clinics in the country. So I think that, there's a huge report called the Broken Promises Report that details where the federal agencies have really failed on those treaties. So I think people think that, Indian nations just kind of kick back and live off the government, but there's very specific reasons for that money, and it's never enough. So I certainly do think compensation and reparations are a discussion that we should be having. I just know that it's messy, but I'm all for it. Long story short. Land tax models, right? And I think that land like I said in the beginning, it's how we measure wealth in this country. The first people that could vote in this country had to own land. It's really, so when our tribal nations had that land taken out from under us, literally, that was a lot to come back from. And those, things that I talked about, those genocidal tactics and the trauma from them, they don't just go away. They really echo through time. I heard this comment on Fox News, go figure, from a commentator, and they were talking about how Columbus Day is a victim of cancel culture and so on and so forth. And the woman said, well, the problems that Indians face have to do with alcoholism and the breakdown of the family. It doesn't have to do with Columbus Day. So we have to remember that, those bigger problems we're facing, like alcoholism, addiction, disease, dysfunction in our families, we can point to times in history, they were taking our children away. How do we build our families back from that? You don't wake up one day and get over that. They were making sure our children didn't know our culture. So, there's a whole lot of that has trickled down for sure. And you can't just say, well, Indians are alcoholics and that's why they have problems. It's so much more than that. And I hope that I've described a little bit of that kind of historical flow for that, so that comments like that are just so based in such falsehoods and politics, when we really have to remember this is about humanity, and we can understand our shared and collective and individual histories and realities and not have to feel bad about it or ashamed about it. It's how we walk forward together. It's by truth telling and being honest about these things.